In this video, I'm going to show you the response of my students to my criticism to their work in my last video. This is the culmination and the final submission of exercise number 1 entitled Maintaining the Continuity of Material. With the objective in mind, they had to create two tasks. One is to create an abstract, intuitive, sculptural form, and task number 2 is to create a form that has a notion of building, meaning maintaining a sculptural quality that has a suggestion of floors, slabs, and any element that you can see in a conventional building. And in the span of 6 days after the last progress report and after my last video, they were able to produce interesting results and very interesting outputs. And I hope you will enjoy it. I think we saw the work of the student with good documentation skills. Not to mention that she has an eye for good architectural form. But for her final submission for form number 1, it meets the brief. However, I think she was too engrossed with the texture of the surface that took time to create that surface using sticks. Had she used a material that is already straightforward that will allow her to experiment more with surfaces, she won't be limited with a simple loop. Imagine if she used a cardboard or any surface and then she cut it into strips. I think she could have produced more loops and folds for her composition. Perform 2 final work. This is actually one of the best submissions this week. You can see that the walls turn into a roof slab or a floor, that it creates an almost enveloping system, and I can imagine this project to be used as a house prototype or even a building prototype. Therefore, for a notion of a building, this is a success. She was the one who introduced the C-section because she was inspired by a building abroad. But look at her work now. Her form number 1 meets the project brief. She has a decent documentation. And then her form number 2 is actually one of my favorite submissions this week because it is an array of volumes, but they're all made of a strip. They're all connected. And when you see it up close, you see some negative spaces or voids wherein the strip also goes through inside, and they're all connected and continuous. And then to create the form wherein it was only limited on a horizontal surface. She wasn't able to transition the surface to vertical and horizontal, but this is her form for final submission. This is one of the most interesting submission for this week because I find it very discomforting for some reason. It reminds me of something very organic, an internal organ or a dead squid or a dead octopus. And I find it very interesting in such a way that she was able to meet a brief and yet he was able to create an ambiguous form that I couldn't read. And it's all connected. Last week, just like everyone else, she wasn't able to meet the project brief. But this time, it's very interesting because she used an interesting material that will allow you to see through the surface or see through the volume. She used a whole acrylic sheet and then she bended it using a heating machine. I think she used a hair dryer so that she'll be able to bend the surface, and then created an interesting form that introduces folding and some creasing. The volume is so controlled, you know that it's sort of a building, so that's the notion of that building. And the fact that she created those levels and layers, then that is suggestive of a floor. Therefore, she's successful in creating a suggestion of a building. This drawing wasn't in the video last week, but online he consulted me about his form number 1 and he approved it. And then when he showed me an iteration of a potential form number 1, which is a SketchUp drawing, I was actually excited to see its full potential. Unfortunately, it ended up with this final submission. And you can see that it's very volumetric and there are some interlocking volumes that sort of disrupt the continuity. It deviates the perception that it is a continuous element because you see solid interlocking volumes instead. For the notion of building, this is successful because you can see the connection of floors and walls and the layering of all these elements. Last week I wasn't able to show his scheme or progress report because I already told him that we're not looking for drawings, but this time he's able to produce a model. Unfortunately, it's missing the brief in a way that it's just one dimension. I think he missed my criticism on one work wherein I was talking about the profile of one scheme, and it didn't have any other dimension to it because it was just done, the continuity and the flow was only done on one axis. It's sort of the same case with this form number one. It doesn't have that volume. Maybe it's volumetric when you make it vertical, but the documentation shows it's on a horizontal surface. And for the notion of a building, it's actually very interesting because technically it's all continuous, but you can recognize these are all skeletal elements. And I find it interesting that this is a very different approach compared to the rest. It's all linear, and I think something that we can find very commendable in terms of creativity. If you remember last week, she didn't have a model, but this time she produced the model version of her drawing. And of course, it didn't disappoint. It met the project brief, beautiful documentation, but how I wish she used a more rigid material and then introduced core so that how she committed to a bending of a surface. For form number two, I'm a little hesitant to commend it because when you look at the drawing, it is actually just one sheet, and now you are seeing sticks that are supporting the horizontal elements above, and it's not part of the overall envelope. So it's like an addition, an excess to the composition. It's the first time that the student will submit, but it's ready for final submission. And for the first form, you notice that it actually meets the project brief, but the documentation is sort of overcompensating. It's the same thing with form number two, wherein it as if that it looks as if she met the project brief, but it's hard to judge because it is cropped in such a way that you cannot see the edges of the model, and at the same time she laid it out in such a way that it looks like a book, and it almost occupies the half of the sheet. I would like to discourage students, distract your audience or your client with unnecessary text, unnecessary layout, when your focus should be your work and content. First submission or a progress report showing us a bridge-like form, and now he's meeting the project brief already. It's just that probably he can improve on the documentation. And you see that the strips, it's continuous, it's just one envelope. It's just that the way that he showed it, it's starting to look like a resting dog or resting animal on the floor. It's a little strange, but again, I cannot fault him for the documentation. It's something that he should just be conscious of and improve on later on. If you remember his form 2 last week, it's almost recognizable. It looks like a bridge. You have two separate elements supporting a horizontal element, so it didn't really meet the objective. But now, with his form 2, I find it very elegant because it's straightforward, and at the same time, it meets the objective of maintaining the continuity of the material, in this case a cardboard. I find the form refined and at the same time very confident in its composition. I'm going to show his project anyway, and as you can see, it also didn't meet the project brief like everyone else. But for this week, for his final submission, it is really an impressive one because I know that it took a lot of time and idea to produce this kind of model, and you can see that there's so much complexity in it, even though it's just a very simple and elegant form, just like the work of the previous student that has a very refined and focused and at the same time a straightforward form. This has the same quality, and if I'm going to associate this with recognizable buildings by known architects, I would probably associate the sensibilities of Calatrava because of the repetitive elements, and yet in this project you can see that the elements are continuous. Unfortunately, for the next submission, which is form number 2, there is a notion of a building. Yes, you see a cylindrical volume and planar elements at the ground, but they're not they're not continuous, they're not connected. To be honest, last time I wasn't able to critique his work properly and I just focused on the documentation part only because the work was actually not addressing any of the brief. But this time it is actually a success because you can see that his work has continuity and it is made of one material. Not to mention that his notion of a building is almost unexpected in a way that probably it's the most symmetrical and the most traditional of all the submissions, because you would expect that in this kind of exercise we will have a collection of very abstract, very sculptural forms. But this guy introduced a very traditional and almost classical type of form and yet meets the project brief. It's our first time submit for final submission. And for form number one, it met the project brief. It's reminiscent of Mobayo's strip. And I feel like she can do more if she wasn't afraid to use the physical model, because when you're looking at the scoring of the surfaces, some of it are shallow, some of it are deep, that it almost broke the strip. For form number two, we can recognize similar submissions as last week, and these are interlocking elements. These are planar elements that are cut and then interlock so that they can be connected. They are not really continuous. The work of the student for my finale in my presentation last week, because I thought with the modest of materials he used a bond paper, he was able to meet the project brief. Unfortunately for this week, I was disappointed because while the enveloping sheet is meeting the project brief, he added unnecessary elements such as this wall of trusses in the negative space. So maybe he thought that he was introducing a building when the project brief is all about creating a sculptural element, hence the terminology intuition. When you introduce these truss elements, these are not part of the overall envelope. Therefore, there was a disruption in the continuity. Form number two, I'm actually pleased that he was able to meet the project brief. And I hope we are on the same page when we talk about continuity, because this time he took it differently, because a lot of students would take the S profile wherein you have a horizontal element becomes vertical and another horizontal that creates the second floor, and vertical and then the third floor, so on and so forth. But this guy, he didn't take that route. He instead created the vertical shaft, and then everything emanated from that center, and then he created different forms out of it, almost like parametric in aesthetic. Remember Pringles last week? He's actually one of my most eager students in the class. He would bug you with questions and I appreciate that. And this time it paid off. I want to show you the first iteration that he created and showed me. It was already meeting the project brief, but I told him that what if we made the strips bigger, because I thought that everyone will get the project brief by this time. So I suggested that he uses a wider strip so that it's more challenging and at the same time more robust and more volumetric. And he was very successful in doing so. Even the documentation, it was such a commitment. It was a good example of a very simple, straightforward documentation. He wasn't able to submit form number two last week because it was just a progress report and he didn't make it. But for this final submission, he was able to meet it the first try. For a building that has walls and floors and slabs, but still maintaining sculptural quality that is very rectilinear. And the documentation is also impressive. So good job. Again, another student's very good presentation skills but didn't meet the project brief last week. But this time, I would say this is the most interesting and most successful work to date, because while others will make it safe while meeting the project brief, this person or this student knows how to push the boundaries of design. So she actually morphed the entire form to create a very interesting volume that is complex, and at the same time you can recognize the continuity of just one material. And she wasn't happy with it. She morphed it and then she inserted and she created some notches so that she can introduce a very fresh form. For form number 2, which is a notion of a building, this is as equally impressive because she introduced layers, which is suggestive of floor slabs. And then she also has hierarchy of spaces. Those floor slabs are almost the same in proportion and scale. And then she has the biggest space in the model that can be suggestive of a lobby. So for a notion of a building, this is one of the best work for final submission for exercise 1. Really impressive job. Able to attend the class last week, but now that she's submitting for the final submission, she submitted 4 schemes, 2 for the form number 1 and 2 for form number 2. For form number 1, one is reminiscent of the other submission that I presented earlier by another student, and the second one is a more complex version that has an intertwining elements to it. And for the form number 2, she had 2 approaches. One is a more horizontal approach wherein you can see and recognize slabs and floors, and the second one has just intertwining and interlocking walls. And for a first time submission, I think this is highly commendable. This student also has a lot of questions because he's coming from a very poetic and expressive point of view. Keep turning down his proposals because I see a lot of excessive elements in his form, and I realized later on that he was operating in a very subjective mindset. His mindset is operating on the highest form of ideas, very platonic, whereas our activity focuses on matter and function, which basically talks about the physical objects around us and how you can work with it so that you can create spaces. As he was consulting, he was showing me these schemes wherein, yes, there are continuous elements and there are additional elements as well. And I told him this is an excess. So maybe his interpretation is that these piercing elements has a continuous concept, and of course I cannot fault him for that if he is operating on a very subjective manner, whereas we are operating on something that is very objective and very literal. And I told him that I will still accept the submission because you are meeting the project brief, except that allow me to say that there is still an excess because it's not part of the brief, therefore it's not part of the design. But you met the project brief. And the final submission came, and of course I was impressed. And he's one of those few students who created negative spaces or punctures on the surfaces and then continue it with the fold inside. That way it's not detaching from the overall envelope, and that is for me something that is noticeable positively. Something that I notice with a lot of designers, sometimes the pure basic form is not enough, and I think I can observe it in this project that he used 2 tones of materials. One is white, one is cardboard brown, and I don't know if you call it cardboard brown, but yeah, it's a cardboard. And I didn't fault it anymore because both materials are achieving the project brief. Why did I create this exercise for my students? Because I want them to be able to quantify what is a very clear concept and what is a very vague concept. We're trying to create an intuitive model. Of course, it'll be very abstract, very sculptural. It's not very architectural yet in such. And the second exercise, or the notion of building, will sort of try to bridge that. That is why somehow I was trying to quantify it on how many percentage is the model in terms of sculptural quality and functional quality. Several percentage of that is actually recognizable, such as floors, slabs, etc. Maybe those are functional elements. And it's the same thing with designing a project. You need to create a quantifiable amount, what is actually readable concept and what is a diluted concept because of the technical and pragmatic constraints. I'm actually perplexed and confused because I thought we were on the same page when it comes to the project brief and the goal of this project. And the final submission has revealed that a few of my students are still at a loss, and probably we need to do this more, and just like in practice we need to keep improving. And I want to point out that when it comes to criticism, we're not criticizing the student or the person, we're criticizing the work, because sometimes we are too sensitive with constructive criticism. I am sensitive as well, but I try to keep it as professional as possible, because we're talking about the work to be improved. And I also want to show my students that I make mistakes, I'm also learning, and I have reservations. And that is also the reason why I'm documenting this journey, because I want to show them that I'm growing as a teacher and as an architect. And this is not going to be the end of this exercise, because there will be more to come as I plan. Maybe to some, this exercise can be done in just one day, but I think the learning outcomes can be better met if we tackle this in a deeper level. And that is why I segmented the exercises into several weeks. We're just on exercise 1, and exercise number 2 was just introduced today, and we had progress reports, which I'm going to show you later on. Record and document as much as I can given the limited time I have, because I'm also practicing and also teaching, especially now it's online. And I try to upload this the next day. As it is, it's already wee hours in the morning. And when you see your notification button, I hope you're there with us, and hope to see you next time. And thank you for watching.